Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I'm your host Derek, and today we are doing something a little bit different. We're actually going to take an episode here. It seems worthwhile to me, I guess, to consider a book, right? And that book is In Quest of the Historical Atom by William Lane Craig. And apologies, no dust jacket. I generally don't like dust jackets. I guess I got a few here behind me that have dust jackets on, but by the time I'm reading those, the dust jackets will be off, never to be seen again, because, I don't know, I guess I don't like dust jackets very much. Alright, so we're going to take a look at this book. It's not something I really want to do regularly on this show, is like, oh, we got to respond to this or that or this. But it's, this one seems worthwhile because it attempts to confront one of the challenges, I guess, Christianity face in our time, right? It attempts to grapple with the strange place that Protestant theology finds itself in light of where empirical understanding finds itself today, right? And it seems to be, at least at this time, one of the more, I don't know, recognized works, in that I feel like a lot of people I've seen on the social medias and such did read this book, and it's rather polarizing, at least based on the Christian dialogue circles I've found myself observing. So, with that in mind, I just want to take a second to talk about it and just respond to a thought on it. So, to me, there is actually, I think, some real benefit to reading this book. His examination, he does a great job, I think, of examining like the role and places of myths throughout time, and it's a great overview of kind of the way that has been thought about in academic settings, and there's some value to that for sure. Similarly, his breakdown of the emergence of humans and human predecessors, along with considering current debates that are going on in that realm, is another excellent overview, particularly for Christians who might be unaware of where those things stand because of a bias towards just not considering the idea of something like evolution, or something like the idea of maybe a more gradual process of the design of creation, the design of humanity, because they have a bias towards looking at Genesis 1 as you know, a literal 24-hour period of days, 6 24-hour periods. And again, we talked about why there might be reason to not consider that way in some previous episodes. Now, it seems that William Lane Craig here does not take it that way. So I think it's really worthwhile for those particular things. All that said, I don't think any of his conclusions, including defining the early Genesis stories as mytho-history, or the idea that humanity did descend from a single pair of ancestors, as well as the theological necessity of the historical Adam and Eve, I don't think any of those conclusions are unassailable. So they're not, he makes a great argument for them. It's not a flawless argument. Obviously, we're humans. We don't make flawless arguments, really. I don't end up in the same place he does, let's just say, on a lot of these things. That said, for understanding where the discussion is at, where the debate is at, it is wonderful, I think, for those things. So he puts together a strong case, and I would say that all of them are definitely possible. Even the idea of a single pair of ancestors certainly can't be ruled out with where sort of the empirical understanding sits today. Although much debate swirls around the subject, obviously, with there being reasonable argument on both sides. So there are, though, a few things worth addressing directly here. And for now, I'm gonna leave aside the whole designation of myth history and mytho-history, which he gets into in great detail. Eventually, I'd like to do an episode or two on that. and looking at that whole terminology, the classification of stories, all of that, I just need to take the time to really clarify my own thoughts about that a bit. I've got a lot swirling around the head. I just need to sit down and at least write some outlines and get exactly what I don't know. I think in pictures, and so not the process of writing out some words helps me clarify what exactly I'm seeing. So, all right. So for today, though, we're going to take a quick look at the one thing I want to focus on this book, which is Craig's theological case for why Adam must be a historical figure, because this is what he comes down to, and this is why for him the question of finding a historical Adam in empiricism has value, is because he believes that the Bible makes the case that there must have been a historical Adam. So we're going to take a look at that particularly. And so I want to start with noting that Craig does not reject the idea that, he does reject the idea that original sin is absolutely necessary to the idea of universal sin, which is something we've talked about in this show. The idea that original sin, you don't have to have that, I guess, for there to be universal sin. And so we looked at this particular story as the story of universal sin. However, his central argument, though, is that Paul, in Romans 5:12 through 21, which is where the original sin argument is often brought forth from, as well as in 1 Corinthians 15:21 and 21, his argument is that Paul is indeed talking about a real person whose sin was either imputed to his descendants, or somehow corrupted human nature, or broke the world in a way where everyone coming after just simply would sin, like it was unavoidable. And so his case here seems to hinge, what really is important to him, I think, in all this, is the idea that Paul is comparing Christ to Adam, and he must then be comparing a historical figure with another historical figure. Right? He's not comparing myth to historical figure, because that, I guess, wouldn't make logical sense to do. Although I think you could do it, so even there it's a little like, but you could make that comparison if you wanted to, but fine, we'll go with that. He's operating under the assumption that you have to compare like kind with like kind. That's what the phrasing says, that's what it puts together. Okay. All of this is it's a fine argument, but poses, for me, the fundamental problem with Protestantism as it sort of stands today, and why I consider myself a sort of post-Protestant, right? To me, a lot of Protestant thinkers, as I've been reading and listening and exploring them, a lot of them seem to have a trouble incorporating the fundamental nature of sort of the spiritual and symbolic representation of things, right? There's kind of a whole element, I think, when we look at Christianity and theology, there's a whole element of mysterious mess to reality, right? That I think they've reasoned and logic themselves out of recognizing. But it's something that I think when we look at creation, and we look at reality around us, there is so much that is mysterious. It just is, right? It just is mysterious. And so while I don't deny for a moment the historical nature of Christ, I absolutely believe that he lived and existed and died on the cross and rose again and all of that. It's important to recognize that as truth, capital T truth, and as the Logos, right? Which is translated word in the Gospel of John, but the word logos means something, which is the original word, that means something far deeper than what we understand when we say word. As the capital T truth and the Logos, Christ contains within him so much more than merely the historical, right? He is spiritual truth, he is symbolic truth, he is historical truth, he's every kind of truth that there is. He is capital T truth, he is the truth. So, just because Christ is a historical figure doesn't mean that when we talk of him, we're only speaking of him historically. We could be talking about the other elements of truth that he encompasses. And so that's where the assumption, right, that just because Paul is referencing Christ in comparison to Adam doesn't have to mean that he's making a reference of another historical figure with a historical figure. Like that, it doesn't have to be that. We could just as easily look at those verses and those passages and see Paul is actually representing two symbolic figures, right? And saying that if we look at Adam symbolically and the idea of sin entering through the world, all of us are corrupted by our Adam-like nature, right? And that's in us. But all of us can be cured of that through Christ, right? A Christ-like nature can be put upon us, right? Symbolically, Christ can inhabit all of us, and we can be cured of the corruption of the Adam nature. So we can look at those passages and see the symbolism in them, and see that we're comparing what Christ is symbolically with what Adam is symbolically. Christ represents the correction of everything that Adam represents. Adam comes to represent this brokenness of humanity, and Christ represents a fixed humanity, a restored humanity, right? And after all, we do generally agree that the death being referenced, right, in the story of Adam goes beyond the idea of the flesh, and we're talking about a spiritual death. We're talking about that kind of a separation from God. And so we're talking about something in the realm of symbolism and spirituality. So the death Paul describes humanity being saved from in those passages could very well be the spiritual death we're talking about. And if that's the case, why is he talking about Jesus as a historical figure if he's talking about the spiritual nature of things, right? And that's interesting, that it's the spiritual death that we're being saved from. It's that symbolism. And so Paul very well may be comparing two symbolic figures, and that we are all first Adam, doomed to death, but may be made alive by the last Adam, Christ, right? And so, Adam symbolically and spiritually resides in all of us, right? As represented by the Old Testament universal ancestry, we see it there. And we seek to die to that and have Christ symbolically and spiritually reside within us. We're risen again with him. And so that would be the path to being alive, whereas with Adam we would be dead. So in the end, that's that particular argument, which he builds up to in the book. I find it to be, I found it to be personally just a little disappointing. I really thought I was going to get something very interesting with where things were sort of building up to that, but then it ended up being, well, Paul has to be talking about Jesus historically, and so therefore he must be talking about Adam historically. And that felt a little unsatisfying and a little like, yeah, but he could be talking about something more than that too. He could be talking about the spiritual truth, the symbolism, what Adam represents, what Jesus represents. So in the end though, I still would recommend the book, I think, as a solid overview of these issues and an intro into the discussion of several of these different areas. You could certainly go deeper in time if you wanted to, but I think it's worthwhile of taking a look at that and getting a feel for it. I think it's especially if you are unfamiliar with these things, then I definitely think it is absolutely worth your time to just familiarize yourself with it. Just know what's out there. So but yeah, I think it's worth looking into that. But in the end, I think it's important to, as Protestants, and we don't want to do this, embrace the mystery of God, and embrace that mystery is very real with us in our world that we experience too, right? And that there's a lot of mystery in the way the spiritual and the material intermingle and come together. And that's the thing that sometimes I think we've missed a little bit as Protestants. And like I said, I mean, it makes it hard for me in some ways to even consider myself still Protestant in that sense. So, all right. That's about all I got on this one. If you read the book and have some thoughts or any ideas on anything I said here, be sure to shoot me a message. You can email me, unschooltheology@protonmail.com, leave a comment on the video, leave a rating, review. Be sure and subscribe so you can catch the other episodes of this show. And until then, we'll see you next time. Thanks.